What happens when one of the loudest voices in political commentary suddenly turns his criticism toward the people who are supposed to be on his side? That is the question exploding around Bill Maher, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders. The title promises a brutal live TV takedown, but here's the important distinction: without a transcript or verified footage of the specific exchange, we cannot honestly claim that Maher actually turned on AOC and Bernie Sanders in the exact way the headline suggests. What we can do is build a dramatic commentary script around the political tension the title is pointing toward: Maher's increasingly sharp criticism of progressive politics, the disagreement over what Democrats should stand for, and the uncomfortable question that keeps coming back: has the progressive movement become too far removed from the voters it says it represents? Because Maher has never been afraid to criticize his own side. And that is exactly what makes his comments so explosive. When a conservative attacks AOC or Bernie Sanders, nobody is particularly surprised. But when Bill Maher does it, that gets attention. Because Maher has spent years positioning himself as a liberal who is willing to challenge liberals. And when he goes after progressive politicians, the reaction can be completely different. Supporters may see it as necessary criticism. Others may see it as betrayal. And when the names involved are AOC and Bernie Sanders, the stakes become even higher. These are two of the most recognizable progressive voices in American politics. Bernie helped reshape the Democratic conversation around economic inequality, healthcare, wages, and corporate power. AOC became one of the most recognizable young progressive politicians in the country, building a massive following around issues ranging from climate change to economic justice. So why would Maher criticize them? And what exactly does he think they're getting wrong? Is he arguing that progressives have become too ideological? Does he believe Democrats are ignoring ordinary voters? Or is Maher making a much bigger argument about the future of the American left? Tonight, we are breaking down the controversy, the political fault lines, the arguments surrounding Maher's criticism, and why a confrontation like this can hit the Democratic coalition harder than an attack coming from the political right. Because sometimes the most damaging criticism doesn't come from your opponent. It comes from someone who says, "I'm on your side, but you're doing this wrong." And that's where this story gets interesting. Bill Maher occupies an unusual position in American political commentary. He's outspoken. He's sarcastic. He's unapologetic. And perhaps most importantly, he doesn't fit neatly into the political box many people expect. Maher has long identified with liberal politics, but his criticism of progressive culture and democratic strategy has repeatedly made him controversial among people on the left. That's why his criticism of figures like AOC and Bernie Sanders can generate such intense reactions. The issue isn't simply what he says. It's who is saying it. When someone from the opposite political camp attacks a progressive politician, supporters can dismiss the criticism as predictable partisan warfare. But when a liberal commentator attacks progressive leaders, supporters have a harder question to answer. Could the criticism contain something worth hearing? That is the uncomfortable question. And it's one reason Maher's political commentary has remained so provocative. He frequently challenges assumptions that many Democrats take for granted. He questions political messaging. He questions cultural priorities. He questions whether certain progressive positions actually connect with the average voter. And he isn't particularly interested in making everyone comfortable. That creates a strange relationship between Maher and the progressive movement. He may agree with progressives on major economic or social issues. But he doesn't necessarily agree with the way progressive politicians communicate those ideas. And that distinction is crucial. A person can agree with the goal while criticizing the strategy. They can support economic reform while questioning the rhetoric surrounding it. They can support climate action while arguing that politicians need to communicate the policy differently. They can support healthcare reform while questioning whether voters understand how a particular proposal would work. And that is where the disagreement with AOC and Bernie becomes fascinating. Both politicians have built political identities around challenging conventional Democratic politics. Bernie Sanders became famous for attacking corporate influence, wealth inequality, and the concentration of political power. AOC emerged as a younger progressive voice who challenged established Democratic leadership and pushed issues that were once considered politically difficult. Their supporters see that as courage. Their critics see it as ideological rigidity. Maher's position, as suggested by the headline, falls somewhere into that conflict. He isn't necessarily arguing that progressive ideas should disappear. He may be arguing that Democrats need to understand the difference between being morally convinced and being politically effective. And that's where the argument becomes brutal. Because political movements don't exist only to make statements. They exist to persuade people. They exist to win elections. They exist to turn ideas into policy. And when a political commentator believes the movement is failing to do that, criticism becomes inevitable. That doesn't mean the criticism is automatically correct. It means the disagreement is worth examining. The larger issue is whether the Democratic Party can hold together voters with dramatically different priorities. There are progressive activists, moderate Democrats, working-class voters, urban voters, suburban voters, young voters, older voters, union voters, independent voters, and people who may agree with Democrats on some issues while strongly disagreeing on others. AOC and Bernie have enormous support among parts of the progressive coalition. But Maher's criticism raises another question. What about everyone outside that coalition? What does the average independent voter hear? What does the working-class voter hear? What does someone struggling with rent, groceries, or childcare hear? And does the language coming from progressive politicians connect with those people? That is the political fault line behind the controversy. And once that question enters the conversation, things can get uncomfortable very quickly. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has become one of the most recognizable progressive politicians in America. Her political rise was extraordinary. She became a national figure by challenging establishment politics and presenting herself as a representative of a younger generation demanding major change. Her supporters see her as authentic. They see her as willing to challenge powerful institutions. They see her as someone who speaks directly to voters who feel ignored by traditional politicians. And that authenticity is a major part of her political strength. But authenticity can also create vulnerability. Because when a politician becomes closely associated with a particular political identity, every statement becomes part of that identity. And critics can argue that the message sometimes becomes more important than persuasion. This is where Maher's criticism becomes particularly interesting. The broader question isn't whether AOC is progressive. Everyone already knows that. The question is whether progressive politics can expand beyond its existing base. Can the movement persuade people who aren't already convinced? Can it communicate complicated policy proposals without turning every disagreement into a moral battle? Can it acknowledge legitimate concerns from voters who don't identify as progressive? Those are difficult questions. And they are not necessarily attacks on AOC personally. They are questions about political strategy. But in today's political environment, strategy criticism can quickly become personal. Supporters hear, "You are weakening the movement." Critics hear, "Someone finally said what everyone else was afraid to say." And that's where political television becomes combustible. Because television rewards conflict. A calm discussion about policy doesn't necessarily go viral. A sharp exchange does. A dramatic disagreement does. A moment where someone appears to turn against their own political allies. That becomes a headline. And that's exactly why the phrase "turned on AOC" is so powerful. It suggests betrayal. It suggests that someone crossed a political line. But the deeper issue is whether Maher's criticism represents a genuine ideological break or simply a disagreement over strategy. Those are very different things. A person can criticize AOC while still supporting many progressive policies. A person can disagree with Bernie Sanders while still believing economic inequality is a serious problem. Politics isn't supposed to be a sports team where supporting one player requires agreeing with everything they say. But political fandom often works that way. Once people identify strongly with a political figure, criticism can feel personal. And AOC has one of the strongest political followings in the progressive movement. That means criticism of her can produce an immediate reaction. Supporters may defend her. Critics may amplify Maher's comments. And everyone else watches the fight unfold. But there is another reason AOC is central to this discussion. She represents generational change. Bernie represents one generation of progressive politics. AOC represents another. And Maher represents yet another perspective. Put those three together, and the disagreement becomes bigger than one television segment. It becomes a debate about where the American left is going. If AOC represents the new generation of progressive politics, Bernie Sanders represents the movement's long-term transformation. For decades, Sanders has argued that economic inequality and corporate influence are central problems in American society. His political message has remained remarkably consistent. He has criticized billionaires. He has attacked corporate power. He has advocated for stronger social programs. He has pushed universal healthcare. And he has repeatedly argued that working-class Americans are being left behind. Those ideas have influenced the Democratic Party far beyond Sanders' own campaigns. Positions that once seemed politically marginal became part of mainstream Democratic debate. That's part of Sanders' legacy. But Maher's criticism raises a different question. Can the movement Sanders helped build actually reach the voters it needs? That's not an ideological question. It's a political one. A movement can have popular ideas and still struggle to communicate them. A politician can correctly identify a problem while failing to persuade enough voters about the solution. And a party can have passionate supporters while losing people who don't identify strongly with the party at all. That tension is at the heart of modern American politics. Bernie's supporters often believe the answer is to go further. More economic populism. More pressure on corporations. More aggressive reform. More emphasis on working-class economics. Maher may be questioning whether the Democratic coalition needs something else. Perhaps more moderation in messaging. Perhaps less focus on cultural battles. Perhaps more attention to voters who feel disconnected from progressive politics. Again, without the actual transcript, we shouldn't attribute a specific statement to Maher that hasn't been provided. But the headline clearly points toward this larger conflict. And it is a fascinating conflict. Because Bernie Sanders has spent decades arguing that Democrats should stop being afraid of bold economic ideas. Maher, meanwhile, has often challenged what he considers progressive excesses. Those perspectives can overlap in surprising ways. Both can criticize corporate influence. Both can criticize political elites. Both can argue that ordinary Americans are frustrated. But they may disagree dramatically about the cultural and political path forward. That's why a disagreement between Maher and Bernie can become more interesting than a disagreement between Maher and a conservative politician. Because they are arguing from within the broader liberal universe. And internal arguments are often more intense than external ones. Think about any political movement. The biggest battles aren't always about whether the movement should exist. They are about what direction it should take. Who should lead it? What issues should come first? How aggressive should it be? How much compromise is acceptable? And how much should the movement change to attract people who aren't already supporters? Those are the questions sitting underneath the Maher-Bernie AOC debate. And they don't have simple answers. Whenever a prominent commentator criticizes people from their own political side, the word betrayal inevitably appears. Supporters ask, why are you attacking your own side? Why aren't you helping the movement? Why are you giving ammunition to political opponents? But critics respond with an entirely different argument. They say, if your own side is making mistakes, shouldn't someone say so? That's the fundamental philosophical disagreement. Is loyalty more important than criticism? Or is criticism necessary precisely because you care about the movement? Maher's political persona has always leaned heavily toward the second approach. He has built much of his appeal around saying things that other people may be reluctant to say. That doesn't make every statement correct. It doesn't make every criticism fair. And it doesn't mean viewers should automatically accept his interpretation. But it explains why his comments attract attention. He isn't trying to sound like a party press release. He's trying to provoke. He's trying to challenge. He's trying to make people uncomfortable. And when he directs that energy toward AOC and Bernie Sanders, the reaction becomes predictable. Some people cheer. Some people rage. Some people accuse him of abandoning progressive politics. And others say that this is exactly what political commentary should be. The controversy also exposes a broader problem in American politics. People increasingly consume political information from personalities rather than institutions. A politician isn't simply a politician anymore. They are a brand. A commentator isn't simply a commentator. They are a personality. And audiences develop emotional relationships with them. That means when a personality changes their position, or even appears to criticize an ally, fans can react as though a personal betrayal has occurred. The phrase "turned on" captures that emotional reaction. But political disagreement doesn't necessarily equal betrayal. In fact, disagreement can be healthy. A movement where everyone agrees on everything is probably not a movement capable of adapting. The challenge is determining whether criticism is constructive or simply designed to generate attention. That's where viewers have to think critically. What exactly was said? What was the context? Was Maher criticizing a policy? A strategy? A politician's rhetoric? Or the entire progressive movement? Without the underlying transcript, we shouldn't pretend to know. But the controversy itself points toward a larger political question. Can Democrats disagree publicly without destroying their coalition? Because if every internal disagreement becomes a war, the party becomes incapable of adapting. AOC doesn't have to agree with Maher. Bernie doesn't have to agree with Maher. Maher doesn't have to agree with either of them. And voters ultimately get to decide whose argument is more persuasive. That's democracy. But in the age of viral clips, nuance is often the first casualty. One sentence becomes a headline. One reaction becomes a controversy. And a complicated political argument becomes, Bill Maher just turned on AOC and Bernie. That may be great for clicks. But understanding the real disagreement requires going deeper. The most important part of this controversy may not actually be Maher. It may be what his criticism says about the Democratic Party. Democrats are a broad coalition. And that coalition contains competing visions of what the party should be. One vision emphasizes progressive economic policies. Another emphasizes electoral pragmatism. Another focuses heavily on social issues. Another argues that Democrats need to concentrate almost entirely on economic concerns. And there are voters who simply want government to function better. These groups don't always agree. That's not necessarily a weakness. But it becomes a weakness when the disagreements cannot be managed. The Maher AOC Bernie debate exposes that tension. AOC's political identity is closely associated with progressive activism. Bernie's political identity is closely associated with economic populism. Maher's criticism often targets what he sees as excesses within progressive politics. Those perspectives can coexist. But they can also collide. And when they do, the Democratic Party has to decide what it wants to prioritize. Does it focus on ideological purity? Does it focus on winning swing voters? Does it prioritize economic messaging? Does it continue emphasizing cultural issues? Does it try to do all of those things simultaneously? That's the strategic challenge. And there is no easy solution. If Democrats move too far toward the center, progressive voters may feel betrayed. If they move too far left, moderate voters may feel alienated. If they try to satisfy everyone, they risk producing a message that satisfies nobody. This is why commentators like Maher can be valuable even when people strongly disagree with them. They force uncomfortable questions. The danger is that provocative commentary can also oversimplify complicated problems. Political movements are not simple. Voters are not simple. And there isn't one magic message that suddenly wins everyone. The American electorate is fragmented. People care about different issues. They respond to different personalities. And they have different economic and cultural experiences. AOC's supporters may see her as exactly the kind of politician Democrats need. Bernie's supporters may believe the party needs to embrace economic populism more aggressively. Maher's supporters may believe Democrats need to step back from progressive cultural politics and reconnect with ordinary voters. All three perspectives can have legitimate arguments. And all three can also have blind spots. That's the part that often gets lost in viral political debates. Everyone wants a winner. But political strategy isn't a boxing match. A party doesn't win because one commentator destroys another. It wins by building a coalition large enough to persuade voters. That's why the real question isn't, did Bill Maher destroy AOC and Bernie? The real question is, are Democrats listening to the voters they need to persuade? That is a much harder question. And it doesn't have a simple answer. At the end of the day, the Maher controversy represents something much larger than one television appearance. It represents a fight over the future direction of liberal politics in America. AOC represents a younger progressive generation. Bernie Sanders represents a long-running economic populist tradition. Bill Maher represents a form of liberal commentary that is increasingly willing to challenge progressive orthodoxy. And millions of voters are watching. Some want bigger change. Some want less cultural conflict. Some want stronger economic policies. Some want political moderation. Some simply want politicians to focus on everyday problems. The question is whether these groups can exist within the same political coalition. That may be the real challenge. Because the future of the Democratic Party won't be determined by one commentator. It won't be determined by one politician. And it won't be determined by one viral clip. It will be determined by voters. Voters will decide which messages resonate. They will decide which politicians they trust. And they will decide whether the party's direction matches their priorities. That's why Maher's criticism matters even if you disagree with him. It forces the conversation. It asks whether progressive politicians are communicating effectively. It asks whether economic populism can become a broader electoral strategy. It asks whether Democrats are listening to independent and working-class voters. And it asks whether political movements can tolerate criticism from within. AOC and Bernie Sanders have powerful supporters. Maher has his own audience. And the fact that these audiences can collide makes the controversy almost inevitable. But there is one thing viewers should remember. Political commentary is designed to provoke emotion. A shocking statement gets more attention than a nuanced one. A confrontation gets more clicks than a policy discussion. And brutal gets more views than complicated disagreement. So before deciding who won, viewers should ask: what was actually said? What was the context? Was the criticism fair? Did the politicians respond? And did the exchange reveal something genuinely important about the direction of American politics? Those questions are far more valuable than simply choosing a side. Because if Maher is right, Democrats may need to rethink how they communicate with voters. If AOC supporters are right, perhaps the criticism underestimates the strength of progressive ideas. If Bernie supporters are right, perhaps the party's biggest mistake is failing to embrace economic populism strongly enough. And perhaps the truth lies somewhere between all three. That is what makes this debate so fascinating. The fight isn't really about one television moment. It's about what liberal politics becomes next. And if the Democratic coalition cannot figure out how to balance progressive ambition with broader electoral appeal, disagreements like this are likely to become even more common. Because Maher isn't the only person asking these questions. Voters are asking them too. And eventually, politicians will have to answer. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Bill Maher's criticism of AOC and Bernie Sanders is exactly what Democrats need to hear? Or do you think he's going too far? Do you believe progressive politicians should change their messaging to appeal to more independent and moderate voters? Or should they stay firmly committed to the policies that built their movement? And most importantly, where do you think the Democratic Party goes from here? Because this isn't simply a fight between three famous political personalities. It's a debate over what the American left should look like in the years ahead. AOC represents one vision. Bernie represents another. Maher is challenging both. And voters are watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications for more explosive political commentary, celebrity-style political drama, and the biggest moments generating conversation across America. And remember, don't just watch the viral clip. Look at the argument behind it. Because sometimes the most important part of a political fight isn't who shouted the loudest. It's what the fight reveals. So tell us in the comments, was Bill Maher right, or did he cross the line?